Guys, I am the best at eulogies during funerals. All I gotta do is start thinking of the death of Star and Select, and goddamn, I just start fucking crying. It was a sad day when we lost the Select and Start buttons. I swear. I mean, this has been a staple of gaming for eons, and everybody has fond memories as a kid of looking at the Select button and not fucking pressing it. All right, I primarily just kind of want to talk about this because this was kind of an interesting evolution in controller design, and it really kind of started in 2013 with the announcement and release of the PS4. Because if you remember, the PS4 was revealed in early 2013, and the console itself wasn't actually a part of that reveal. All they showed off was the DualShock 4, which was a massive reveal in of itself because this was kind of the very first time since the original PlayStation that the PlayStation controller actually saw some significant redesign. Like the PS3 controller right here is basically unchanged from what a PS1 controller fundamentally was. Yeah, there's a couple differences here and there, but basically, by and large, this was the exact same design as the PlayStation 1 DualShock. Even right down to the Start and Select buttons. Which, yeah, these have been staples of game controllers for decades, but, I mean, you ever just kind of stop and think about these for a bit? What the hell do these mean? I mean, it all kind of goes back to the original NES controller. We have B, A, Start, and Select. And by and large, in most games, Start was pause. Every now and then, you'd have a game that really loved to be quirky and different, and sometimes Select was the pause button. And goddamn, if those games were people, I would not want to hang out with them. But why did we have Start and Select back in the day? Well, pretty much most NES games genuinely used the Start button to start the game. Nowadays, looking at a bunch of modern games, a lot of them have a different method of, going from the title screen into the initial menu, and then, you get into the menu and you select, start a game or something like that, and you usually use, like, the standard A button or whatever the primary, like, accept button is on the controller you're using. But back during the NES days, I can't really think of a ton of games that used the A button to just get past the title screen, and pretty much every time, you had to hit the Start button. And the Select button was kind of always there as a secondary version of the Start button if you so needed it. But some games took Select very literally. I mean, you look at the original Super Mario Brothers, and you had to hit the Select button on the title screen to go from one-player mode or two-player mode. But I think over time, as game design evolved, I think they kind of realized, like, why are we hitting Select for this? Doesn't it make more sense to go up and down on the menu if the options are vertically just right there? And then at that point, if you're using the D-pad to select options, why the hell not just use the A button to select the option that you want? Why do I have to move my thumb over to the Start? So either way, over the years, I think game designers started to realize that using these buttons for those specific tasks didn't really make a ton of sense. Like, I think it's just kind of making things overly complicated. Like, yes, it technically makes sense on an NES title screen if you're trying to select the option you want, and then you hit Start to start the option you want. Oh yeah, you hit Select and you hit Start. Yeah, on paper that makes sense. But in practice, especially once you know how this controller kind of works, it makes much more sense to just use the D-pad and use the face buttons. So over time, games started using the Start button less and less to actually start a game. A lot of title screens started just saying, press any button. Or hell, a lot of title screens, even if they say press Start, that genuinely just means press any button. And the Start button pretty much just became the pause button. Which, interestingly, you do have a couple of examples throughout history of the button being labeled as pause. Weirdly enough, the Atari 5200 controller, as dog-ass as this controller is, it was pretty revolutionary in the sense that not only did it have a Start button, but it had a separate button just to pause the game. Now, while this was kind of a revolution at the time, it doesn't really make a ton of sense for these to be two separate buttons. Like, I mean, yes, starting a game and pausing a game are two separate ideas, but starting a game and pausing a game are two things that happen at two completely separate times. I don't think they ever really clash into each other where it's like, oh man, I have to start a game and pause a game at the same time. So it just feels kind of wasteful and redundant to have them as two separate options when you just have them a part of one singular button. Which, hey, that's what the GameCube did. I mean, at least it labeled the start button as start/pause, which weirdly enough, this was during an era where Nintendo kind of gave up the select button on home consoles for a bit there. So over on the N64, they also just had a single start button in the middle of the controller and nothing else. To be fair, these controllers introduced a lot of other buttons that I think, like, if you desperately needed a button to act as a select button, you could just pick whatever you want, the Z button on the back, one of the 4 C buttons, L and R, I don't care. But I think that shows as early as the mid-90s, I think they were kind of starting to realize that, like, hey, that select button, like, why do we even have that? That didn't stop Sony, though, from putting that on their controllers for the next couple of decades. That was probably because the PlayStation controller was fundamentally based on the original Super Nintendo controller with a select button right there. And for a while, Sony was definitely a if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of company with PlayStation, which definitely was a criticism they faced for a bit there. You know, the fact that the PS3 controller felt pretty damn archaic at the time. Wasn't like it's a bad controller. This is still a perfectly fine feeling controller. However, compared to something like the 360 controller, where it felt like Microsoft truly went back to the drawing board and found what worked and what didn't with the original Xbox controller and created an incredibly comfortable and well-designed gamepad. Or something like with the Wii, where Nintendo just completely flipped everything on its head and just gave you this bizarre thing. By comparison, Sony's PS3 controller was very much just, it was the same PlayStation controller you're always used to. So I think going into the PS4 generation, Sony definitely kind of had a fire under their ass to do something a little more different. And that's how we got the PS4 controller. Ah! And not only did the DualShock 4 get a much more ergonomic redesign, but we also have a bit of a different setup here. Options, share, and this giant-ass clickable touchpad. Now, technically, it's not like we're really losing anything. If anything, we're gaining an extra button with the share button, because options is basically the replacement for the start button. The touchpad, clicking that in, that pretty much is the select button. And now we got the share button, which is fundamentally a system-wide button. It's not really something that a game can really like utilize as an in-game button. Rather, you click that and you can get a screenshot of what you're doing right now or save a video clip, whatever. You know, this was kind of the first instance of a controller including that feature. Now it's a standard across the board. But yeah, this was a bit of a shocker because start and select have been staples of the gaming landscape that don't fucking matter. Yeah, good on Sony for finally taking a look at the design of these controllers and being like, wait a second, what the fuck does start and select even mean? Start and select, in my opinion, feel like they were like these long-standing leftovers from the arcade era in gaming. Like, it makes sense to have a start button in the arcade because, you know, you're popping quarters into an arcade machine. Your money's on the line here. You want to specifically start the game when you start the game. And with a giant-ass joystick in the way, I'm imagining it's easy to kind of like accidentally like knock into that or accidentally select something you don't want to. So yeah, you know, like a select and start button makes sense kind of with that more retro game mentality. Now, the way I'm describing that kind of implies that a lot of arcade machines had specific start and select buttons. They didn't really. A lot of times they had the 1 or 2 player buttons, but basically what I'm getting at here is start and select kind of feel like they were more of like a very old school game design mentality that didn't really evolve, because oftentimes what would start and select be used for? Well, start would pause the game, which brings you into the menu, and if select is used at all, it would be used to bring up like a secondary pause menu. Oftentimes that would be like the map screen or something like that. Or who knows, it would be the other way around. Select would give you just pure blown options of like, oh yeah, tweak these settings while also pausing the game. And then start would give you like, oh, here's your world map, here's some upgrades you can do to your character, all that stuff. But yeah, these buttons had a function, but them being labeled as start and select, yeah, that just doesn't really feel like it really suits them anymore. The DualShock 4 replacing start with options makes sense because pretty much every time you would hit start in a game, it would bring up the pause menu, which fundamentally gave you options. And then the touchpad in the middle, originally I kind of felt like that was like an awkward replacement for the select button, but it makes a lot of sense because normally this is used for like bringing up your map or something like that. And I just feel like clicking in this big square pad feels really natural when you're bringing up a map screen in game, you know? Like a map is a big square piece of paper, so you have this big flat surface that you touch down on, and boom, there you go, here's your map. Now, it's not always used for a map, but fundamentally, when it comes to game design, I think it makes sense to have a button that's just like, hey, this is for your options. You can pause the game while also tweaking any settings that you need to as well. Whereas the touchpad right here, yeah, it also pauses the game, but I think this feels much more natural to click in for maybe more like in-universe options. Like I said, like a map screen or an upgrade screen, a skill tree or something like that. Now you can also, you know, like use this as a touchpad and all of that, but like how many games actually use that and it's not just a complete gimmick? And I'm saying that as a baby boy Nintendo bitch. When I say like, yeah, I think the touchpad part of this whole button is a gimmick, that's how you know, holy shit, dude, that must be gimmicky. Sometimes they utilize it in cool ways, but for the most part, it's kind of, this is just kind of used as a button. But right alongside Sony, the other companies followed suit, which is funny because even Microsoft, ever since the beginning of the Xbox brand, they never used select as a button. They've always had start, but they called their select button back, which also doesn't make much sense. How many times have I actually used this button and it does what the button is labeled as? Oh, it brings me back. It brings me to a different page. Like, I can't recall any time that this button actually did, in quotes, bring me back. But Microsoft had a solution. Introducing the Xbox One control. I always hated these buttons. What the hell? I don't know what to call these fucking things. Oh yeah, hit the 3 lines button. Oh, hit the 2 boxes button. Like, what do you call these? With the DualShock 4, like, yeah, I don't think options is a really sexy name for a button, but at least it's pretty cut and dry. Like, yeah, like hit the options button. And also, if you tell somebody, hey, hit the touchpad, it's kind of hard to fuck that up. Like, what, are they gonna be like a touchpad? Oh, what, this one? Okay, so looking it up, these 2 buttons have names. This is called the view button, and this is called the menu button. Which I gotta be honest, yeah, again, like, I don't like that. The menu button, sure, you know, brings up the pause menu, your options, all of that stuff, but I kind of get that confused because to me, the middle Xbox button, you know, that brings you home, and I think it's pretty easy if you tell somebody, hey, hit the menu button, they're probably gonna go, okay, and they hit the, you know, they hit the Xbox button because it brings them to the Xbox's menu. Then this being view, yeah, I don't fucking know. You know what I always thought? When I initially saw this button, I thought this was the Xbox's share button. Like, I don't know, I see 2 boxes there. It could be like social media windows or, you know, hey, projecting an image or a video onto social media. I don't know. In my opinion, I think these buttons definitely need like a label. I think they should have a much more defined thing you can call it that you don't have to look up. For example, I think Nintendo got this right with the Wii Remote because even as early as the Wii days, Nintendo kind of brought back the select button, but they also weren't calling it that. Sometimes on the Wii Remote, these were not start and select, they were plus and minus. I think this was a great move on their part because everybody knows what a plus and minus button is. You know, it's hard to get that fucked up. And it also doesn't put them in a corner of like, oh yeah, these are the start and select buttons. So, oh, this has to start the game and this has to select options or whatever. Now, I think the way they labeled these was incredibly smart. However, that didn't mean that they weren't start and select. On the Wii Classic controller, they were labeled as such. Now, to be fair, I think that was primarily because this controller was meant to replicate something like a Super Nintendo controller. So when you're playing Super Nintendo games on the Wii, it makes sense to be like, hey, this is select, this is start. So you just know, like, hey, if Super Nintendo game is telling you hit select, hit start, like, yeah, you know what to do. But they maintained that going into the Wii U generation, you know, still labeled as select and start. Which I thought was kind of funny, considering that, you know, you're calling these the plus and minus buttons, but you're also calling it the start and select buttons. Pick a lane, fellas. But yeah, during the 8th generation of consoles, you know, the Wii U is right alongside the Xbox One and PS4. This was the last major console using start and select buttons until the Nintendo Switch. The Joy-Con and Switch Pro controllers got rid of the start and select labels and instead give you plus and minus buttons full on. And thus, we fundamentally entered the true death of the start and select buttons. None of the major consoles these days actually have buttons labeled as such. Hell, Sony took a page out of Microsoft's book and got rid of the labeling with the options and share buttons. Now they have these vague symbols. In fact, the options button has the exact same symbol as the Xbox's options button now. And out with the Switch generation, even though the plus button has fundamentally replaced the start button, when it comes to starting a game, Nintendo kind of introduced a new format of starting a game with the Switch that I've noticed other games start doing now too, even if they aren't on a Switch 1 or 2. And it's the idea of like, to start the game, you hit the L and R buttons together, which I think is interesting. Now, I think they primarily did that so then they could figure out on the fly, like, hey, how are you holding your controller? Because sometimes, you know, you might be holding two Joy-Con like this, so then you're gonna hit the L and R buttons like this. Or maybe you're holding a Joy-Con by itself separately, you know, you hit the two buttons like that. So I think that's just a quick way for them to figure out like how you're doing that. But I also think for the player, kind of helps get them ready to play the game. You know, you kind of have to hold the controller like this. And I think that kind of gets your hands in a proper position holding the controller. So I think that makes sense, but it undeniably is a bit more of a complicated way to start a game compared to how things were back in the old days. Back in the day, you just had a specific start button. There was no button combination or no vague symbols or nothing like that. You had a start button and then a select button for no fucking reason. It was never used, but still, you had them both. Those were the days, eh? Now, do I miss start and select? No, God, no, I don't give a fuck. I just think it's interesting to look back at the history of controllers and see how long it kind of takes for certain things to actually evolve. You know, start and select were just seen as staples on game controllers. You just had them, you know, like you needed them. But I think with the PS4 generation, they started to kind of look at things again and realize like, well, what do these buttons actually mean and what are they actually being used for? And I think sometimes you kind of have to let go of the past and just kind of do something a little bit new and different. Because it's great to honor the past sometimes, but it gets to a point where you're just kind of thinking like, okay, well, why the f do we need a button labeled as select? What does that mean? That doesn't make any sense. But to be honest, I think it's really funny that we're being critical of the select button, but then we're gonna introduce a goddamn C button and act like this is useful in any fucking way.